Okay, the number one reason why random sampling is important, or how we sample, is the idea of inference. Now, inference is really important because it says that whatever I learn from my sample, I can actually apply to the larger population. I can infer it to my larger population. And it's really unlikely that the results we get from a random sample is exactly like what we would get from the population. And that's not what we're really looking for. We're not looking for exact results. If we wanted exact results, we'd actually go ahead and do a census. But the idea behind random sampling being good for this inference is that any error we have is due to chance, not bias. So we're eliminating this chance of bias. We are leaving any errors or any mistakes that happen. It's just due to random chance. We had no part of it, and we did everything the best we possibly could. And when we use that, when we leave things up to chance, then we can start using the laws of probability. And in chapter 5, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about probability, because we are always looking at what's the chance that we'll get a result like this? What's the chance something like this will happen? Is this really reliable information? And so the laws of probability allows that trustworthy inference to be made about the regular population. And the laws of probability, they account for that margin of error that would come from random chance. So any errors we have get calculated in with that margin of error. So a lot of times in statistics you'll say, well, we estimate about 43% of the population to believe in vaccinations, plus or minus 2%. So that plus or minus 2% is purposely calculated in there based on that possibility of error from random chance. But you can only do that reliably if you used a true random sampling method. Now, one thing that's really, really important to remember is that larger random samples are going to give you better information about the population than smaller random samples. So you always want to try and have a large sample. And we'll talk more in chapter 7 about why we want the larger random sample and how that works. But the idea is that the more information you have, the less variability you'll have in the information, and it's just less likely that one little thing is going to throw everything off because we have so low numbers, so low individuals participating. So the more people we have, that effect of the one person that may be an outlier or may have purposely tried to throw things or something and introduced bias in there unbeknownst to us, they're going to have a lower effect because we have such a huge sample. And so really, really important to know is that a random sample says now I could take this information to the larger population. And that's the whole idea, because I don't want to know about just my sample. Any information I get, if it's not a truly random sample, then I can't do anything with the information. It's telling me about my sample. It's not telling me anything about my population. And so everything is just worthless. Those voluntary response samples, those convenience response samples, classic, they're not telling you anything about the population. They're telling you about the sample itself because it was so poorly done. Okay, errors, bias. Errors and bias kind of go hand in hand. What can go wrong with our sample surveys? So we've got two types of errors. We've got our sampling errors, or bias that results from our sampling errors. These are mistakes that are made in the process of taking the sample that can lead to inaccurate information about the population. And so we've got our bad sampling methods, the voluntary response and the convenience sample. And then we have the idea of undercoverage. So even if we try to do a simple random sample, we try to do the sample right, but we're not careful about how we're picking that. For example, if you are trying to sample homes or households in the US, and you use a simple random sample of phone numbers, you're leaving out households without phones. You're leaving out people who have unlisted numbers. Or you're totally leaving out people who are homeless, in prison, maybe living in dorms where they don't have a real phone number in there because it's a school phone number. And so you have to be really careful about when you start trying to figure out who you're going to sample from, how you're going to figure out who all they are so you can accurately pick that sample. So picking a phone number may not be good, but it may based on the situation. So you have to just kind of be careful on how you're doing that, because you can end up with undercoverage that will skew your results or introduce bias because you are overrepresenting or underrepresenting. In this case, you'd be underrepresenting a certain population. And so this comes from that whole process of going through and picking that sample. Now our next one is the non-sampling errors. And sometimes you have an effect on this, and sometimes it just happens, and there's not really a lot you can do about it. So non-sampling error is an error that occurs after you have actually picked your sample. The first one is our non-response. And so these are the people that when someone calls and asks them to participate in the survey, they hang up. They don't participate in the survey. And those are the non-response. Now, you're going to have non-responses every time you do, especially phone surveys. But if it ends up being that a huge amount of your sample does not participate, then you may have to start all over with a new sample, because it's not going to be truly accurate, because all those people who do not respond may have something in common that's causing them not to respond. And that viewpoint is being totally ignored due to their lack of willingness to participate. Okay, our next one is the response bias. And this one is an interesting one. This is when an individual gives an untrue answer because they feel their true response may reflect badly upon them. And this happens a lot, especially with politics, because people will say that they vote and say that they care about this and that when they truly don't. They just don't want to get involved. They feel like it's not worth their time. But if they sit there and they act so negatively on the phone, they worry about what people are going to think about them. And so they alter their response based on what they think another person would think of them. And so you have to be really careful about how you word things and stuff like that or what you're asking about, so that way you can make sure you get the best response possible. Making sure that people know that their responses are anonymous, that it will never reflect on them. That can help ensure a little bit of honesty there in those responses. And the last one is our wording of a question. And so this is a confusing question. May make it where a person just kind of answers whatever because they don't really understand what you're asking. Or you can have a leading question that may lead to an inaccurate response. So when people are doing surveys and they're asking these questions of people, you want to know exactly what they're asking. Not some like generalized thing, the exact wording. And it's important that the wording is the same every time. So here's an example. Do you believe that cell phones in the classroom interfere with student learning and should be banned in the schools? That interfere with student learning is saying that these phones are bad. We pay all this good money to schools to educate our children and give them the best future possible, to give them all the resources that they can, so that way if they decide now or 10 years from now or 20 years from now to go to college and better their lives, they can be successful in college. They could be successful if they go to trade school. They can be successful in whatever they choose to do because we did the best we could to prepare them. And if we allow cell phones, we're taking this. We are interfering with that student learning. We're throwing our money away. And do we really want to do that with our hard-earned money? And so when you lead in with wording like this, all of a sudden you get people thinking, well, oh my gosh, I didn't really think cell phones were that much of a problem, but yeah, I really don't want that money to get thrown away. I really don't want that. And so it makes them kind of rethink their original opinion because of the way the question was worded. And so you want to make sure that the way you word things aren't leading people in one direction or another, because you will get different responses. And a really interesting study to do is have one group go ask one question leading one way, another group ask the same people the question leading another way, and another group ask the same people a question that just doesn't lead either way. Very open-ended. How do you feel about this? And it's interesting to see how those responses will change. And especially if you space them out like a month apart or something, and then analyze that data. Do you believe that cell phones can provide emergency access to students and should be allowed in schools? So now all of a sudden we're starting to put a positive spin on that. Well, if there's an emergency, I want to be able to get hold of my kid. I want to know that they're safe. I want to know that. And if I can't have that, then what's the purpose? Then I don't know what's going on with my kid, and they're my number one priority. Now all of a sudden you're leaning kids the other direction. And what you'll find in surveys is they'll say, they ask this question: should cell phones be allowed in schools? Totally not leading any direction, but people will, based on maybe their own personal biases, based on whatever, will tweak the question and get different results, get people to lead one way or another. So we got to be careful of that. So these are our non-sampling errors. What happens after we've done the sample and then now we start participating in, and this would be, a lot of this is an observational study because we're actually talking to people, we're asking about stuff, we're observing them, we're never actually experimenting with people. Okay, and that is it for our 4.1c. We're done with 4.1 at this point. In 4.2, we're going to take a look at, now that we've gathered our sample, how would we run an experiment? So we're going to talk about the specifics of experiments and how those work.